Before the sun even crested over the thatched roofs of Willow Creek, Sarah was already standing before her polished tin mirror, smoothing down her pale blonde braid. Today the village was holding its annual autumn fair, which meant the central square would brim with more souls than any ordinary weekday ever saw. Martha set a heavy clay pitcher of fresh milk onto the wooden table and offered a knowing grin. "Still spinning around in front of that looking-glass, are you?" she teased. "Well, you don't expect me to walk into the fair looking all disheveled, do you?" Sarah retorted with a musical laugh. Ethan, who was busy mending an old leather wagon strap near the hearth, glanced up at his daughter and shook his head. "If your striking looks brought in any actual profit around this farm, we'd be the wealthiest folks in Jackson County by now." "See there, Dad, even you admit I'm a stunner," Sarah teased brightly. "Oh, the whole county knows it," Ethan grumbled, while Martha stood up a little taller, acting as if her daughter's beauty was entirely her own personal achievement. An hour later, Sarah was clipping down the dusty dirt road alongside her closest girlfriends. Lily carried a woven basket stuffed with fresh brown eggs, Clara held a bolt of homespun linen under her arm, and May gripped a small tied bundle of dried sweet apples. All the way down the lane, the young women giggled, tossed playful teases back and forth, and gossiped endlessly about the local farm boys who were sure to show up at the fairgrounds. "Word has it that Austin's been casting sheep's eyes at you again," Lily whispered with a sly wink. "Let him look, it doesn't cost me a bit of sight," Sarah waved off dismissively. "And Nicholas asked my ma yesterday whether you were thinking about settling down and getting hitched," Clara chimed in. "Well, he can start by learning how to talk about something other than his prize-winning plow horses," Sarah laughed. When they finally reached the bustling fairgrounds, the girls instantly realized today would be no different than any other. The moment Sarah stepped between the vendor rows, the men started rubbernecking. One young fellow immediately gave up his prime spot by a merchant's stall, another thrust a crisp red apple into her hand, and a third practically sprinted over to help carry Lily's egg basket, even though Sarah hadn't batted an eye in his direction. "Sarah, please let me carry that for you," piped up a flustered local lad. "No, thank you kindly." "Then let me." "I said no thanks." "Well, at least let me walk you over to the wagon." Lily muffled a giggle behind her hand. "Look at that, and the sun hasn't even reached its peak yet. Maybe I ought to start charging a toll for all this unwanted attention," Sarah joked. Near the dry goods and fabric stalls, a respectable local landowner dressed in a spotless wool vest walked up. He exchanged hearty greetings with Ethan, who had just pulled his horse-drawn wagon up to the hitching post, and the two men conversed in low, serious tones off to the side. Sarah didn't think much of it until her father ambled back with a peculiar, knowing smirk plastered across his face. "What in the world is so funny?" she asked. "Oh, nothing much, little lady." "Dad, out with it." "Looks like we're fixing to have suitors coming to call real soon." Lily clapped her hands together in sheer delight. "Well, I'll be! Who is it?" "The eldest boy from the Miller homestead over across Pine Ridge," Ethan replied. "You don't say," Clara gasped. "The very same," Ethan nodded. Her girlfriends immediately broke into frantic whispers, but Sarah only reached up with total indifference to adjust her blonde braid. "So what?" "What do you mean, so what?" May squawked, completely scandalized. "It's a formal courting visit, that's what." "Big deal. Let him show up first and then we'll see." Ethan studied his daughter carefully through narrowed eyes, but chose to keep his peace. On the walk back home, the girls spent the entire afternoon chattering endlessly about the upcoming suitors, while Sarah gazed up at the pale evening sky as if they were talking about a complete stranger. She was entirely convinced she had all the time in the world and that the line of men waiting to make her their wife would stretch on for a lifetime. Martha spent the entire morning running frantically around the spotless wooden cabin, scrubbing surfaces that were already immaculate, while Ethan made a second trip out to the barn just to double-check that the carriage horses were securely tethered. Sarah sat perched leisurely on the low wooden front porch step, watching their frantic hustle with an attitude so detached you would have thought they were expecting distant travelling kin rather than a man coming to court her. "At least put on your Sunday bonnet, girl," Martha finally snapped, unable to take it any longer. "What for?" "So folks don't get the wrong idea and think we have no manners. If they're coming out here to court me, they can look me in the eye instead of staring at a piece of cloth." Martha let out a heavy sigh and retreated back to her wood stove. By high noon, a polished buckboard wagon rolled to a halt right outside their front gate. Peter stepped down, accompanied by his father. The young man was tall, broad-shouldered, and neat as a pen, dressed in a clean homespun coat. When he offered his greetings, his voice was steady, calm, and deeply assured. Ethan could tell right off the bat that the boy carried himself with genuine dignity, completely devoid of swagger or nervous fidgeting. Around the dinner table, the talk initially centered strictly on farming, fertile soil, and the recent harvest yields. Peter answered every question with level-headed wisdom, while his father merely nodded from time to time in silent approval. Sarah remained mostly quiet, only occasionally lifting her gaze to size up the young guest. Peter tried on several occasions to strike up a personal conversation with her. "They say you do the finest needlework in the county." "I manage. And word is folks can't help but notice you at every single fair." People tend to flap their gums about a lot of things. Ethan was already starting to squirm uncomfortably in his chair. Yet Peter took no offense and maintained his polite demeanor throughout. Finally, his father carefully steered the conversation toward the main event. "We won't beat around the bush. We've come to ask for your parental blessing." A heavy silence fell over the cozy room. Martha even allowed herself a hopeful smile. Ethan glanced sideways at his daughter Sarah. Everyone sat frozen, waiting for her verdict. The young woman looked straight at Peter and said calmly, "No." The smile instantly vanished from Martha's face. "Daughter," she cried out in shock. "I said no, Mother." Peter silently lowered his gaze to his boots. His father let out a weary, rattling sigh. Ethan's face flushed a deep, embarrassed crimson. "Can we at least have a reason?" Ethan demanded once the crestfallen guests had hitched their horses and driven away. Sarah gave an indifferent shrug. "I suppose." "Well, spit it out. What is it?" "His nose." The cabin grew so deathly quiet you could hear the pine logs popping inside the iron stove. "What in tarnation did you just say?" Ethan barked, his jaw dropping. "The man's got a mighty big nose, Dad." "And you turned down a fine gentleman strictly because of his schnoz? What if any young'uns we had took after him in that department?" Ethan slammed his ceramic mug down on the table so hard the sweet cider sloshed clean over the rim. "Are you out shopping for a husband or measuring noses? I want good-looking babes, Pa. And a good, honest husband doesn't rank at all? A good man is fine and dandy, but looks matter too." Ethan could only throw his hands up in sheer exasperation and storm right out into the yard. That very evening, Lily, Clara, and May came rushing over to Sarah's house in a tizzy. The scandalous news had already made the rounds across half the village. "They're saying you turned Peter down flat," May blurted out without catching her breath. "I sure did." "Why on earth would you do that? He's a catch. If you girls like him so much, you ought to go hitch yourselves to him." The girlfriends exchanged bewildered looks. Lily broke the ice with a giggle, and May joined right in a second later. Before long, all three of them were howling with laughter, even Sarah herself. At 17, it all felt like one big amusing game. Suitors came marching in one after another, and her future still stretched out endlessly before her. Yet the very next morning, as Ethan walked back from the community well, he ran into a neighbor who gave him a knowing grin and called out, "Heard Peter didn't make the cut. Don't you worry none. A beauty like your Sarah will have plenty more suitors beating a path to her door." Ethan managed a tight smile in return, though for some reason those friendly words brought him no comfort at all. By sundown, another unfamiliar wagon creaked to a halt outside their fence, and Martha, peering anxiously through the lace curtain, whispered in stunned disbelief, "Ethan, looks like we've got fresh suitors pulling into the yard." The following day, the whole village was buzzing about the newest round of visitors. Before folks had even finished gossiping about the Peter fiasco, a strange buckboard cart rolled right up to Ethan's gate, bringing callers all the way from a neighboring township. This time the suitor was Levi, a towering, heavily muscled young farmhand whom folks swore could hoist a full 100-pound sack of grain from the grod-house to the mill all by his lonesome. When he stepped through the front door, he practically had to duck his head to clear the low oak ceiling beam. Martha's face lit up like a Christmas tree, and Ethan figured surely his daughter wouldn't find a single flaw to pick at this time around. Levi wasn't much of a talker, but he was undeniably polite. He hauled a massive sack of wheat flour right into the kitchen as a generous gift, and even took a moment to fix the sagging wooden gate out front that had been dragging for months. "See there?" Martha whispered softly to her stubborn daughter. "That boy's got pure gold hands." Sarah merely offered a cryptic smile. Around the dinner table, Levi carried himself with quiet confidence, holding forth on crop yields, livestock, and pasture management. Everything was humming along smoothly until Sarah suddenly lobbed a bizarre question his way. "Are you quick-witted, Levi?" The burly farm boy was completely thrown off balance. "Well, I don't rightly know." "What do you mean you don't rightly know? Ain't nobody ever complained none." "Then let's see how you do with a riddle." Ethan nearly choked on his cup of cider. "Sarah, hush up." "Let 'em take a crack at it, Pa." Levi chuckled good-naturedly. "All right, let's hear it, little lady." "What runs without legs and weeps without eyes?" The strapping lad scratched his thick head in deep concentration. "Search me, I ain't got the foggiest." "Water," Sarah answered with a smug grin. "Give me another one," Levi challenged, rising to the bait. "Fine then, what has a tongue but never speaks a single word?" He stared at the ceiling tiles, stumped. "A milk cow?" May burst out laughing from the corner, having just popped over to borrow some linen from Martha. Even Ethan couldn't suppress a grin. "A church bell," Sarah declared triumphantly. "Care to try your luck at one more?" But Levi couldn't crack the third riddle either. After that, Sarah simply gave a slow, pitying shake of her head. "No dice." "What do you mean, no dice?" the bewildered young man asked. "I ain't marrying you." "Is this whole foolishness on account of some riddles?" "On account of the riddles, yes." For the first time all evening, Levi stared at her as if he couldn't quite decide whether to bust out laughing or storm out in a rage. Slowly, he pushed his chair back from the table. "Well, I reckon it just wasn't in the cards for us then." He offered a polite farewell to the family and drove off into the dusk. Once the rumbling of his wagon wheels faded down the country lane, Ethan sat in heavy silence at the head of the table. "Don't you dare sit there and tell me he wasn't to your liking either," Martha finally burst out. "He wasn't. And what in God's name was wrong with him this time? He couldn't solve my riddles." Ethan threw his hands up and buried his face in his palms. "Daughter, the man's a dirt farmer, not a town clerk." "Exactly my point, Pa." "And what's that supposed to mean?" "Because if a man's thick-headed, no amount of acreage is ever going to save him." The next morning, the whole village was cackling over the riddle debacle. The local girls laughed so hard they nearly spilled their washwater down their petticoats, and the farm boys at the market started testing each other with riddles just for sport, instantly turning Levi into a local legend. A week later, Lily stopped by Sarah's porch with some big news. "You'll never guess what I heard." "What now?" Levi's going around telling everybody that before a man comes a-courting around here, he better go memorize 100 riddles first." Sarah joined right in with her girlfriend's peals of laughter. At the time, it all felt like a harmless, bubbly game. Nobody was worrying about the march of time, and nobody was counting the years. Suitors came and suitors went, and Sarah remained unshakable in her belief that the absolute best husband was still somewhere just over the horizon. Yet that very evening, Lily nervously dropped a piece of news on her friends that instantly wiped the mirth right off their faces. "I've got suitors coming to call next week, and this time I'm going to tell them yes." Lily sat perched on the low wooden porch step, sorting through bright-colored ribbons for her upcoming wedding wreath, when Sarah sauntered up to her family's front gate. Only a few months prior, the two of them had been running wild to the local Saturday dances, making fun of the awkward farm boys and arguing over who was the best dancer on the square. Now, fresh pine lumber for a cedar dowry chest rested right outside the cabin door. Embroidered linen hand towels fluttered under the straw eaves, and Lily's mother was busy counting out ceramic jars destined for the wedding feast. Everything in sight screamed of a looming celebration. "Well, well, if it isn't the blushing bride-to-be," Sarah teased with a grin. "Are you fixing to be a proper housewife any minute now?" "Don't you go scaring me," Lily laughed nervously. "I ain't slept a wink for 3 whole nights straight." "What on earth is there to be scared of?" "Because from here on out, it's all for real." Sarah plopped down right beside her. "Well, I sure wouldn't be in any rush." I know. You wouldn't rush even if you had 10 years to spare." "And rightfully so. A girl's got to choose carefully." Lily shook her head with a fond smile, deciding not to argue the point. The whole village turned out to celebrate Lily's wedding in style. From the crack of dawn, the courtyard of Lily's homestead overflowed with people. Horse-drawn wagons lined the wooden fences. The long outdoor tables were laden with steaming platters of roasted meat and potato pies, and the local fiddlers sawed away on their instruments so loudly they could be heard clean across the valley. Sarah arrived alongside Clara and May. Dressed in her finest holiday gown, she predictably drew every eye in the place. "Well, well, if it isn't the blushing bride-to-be," Sarah teased with a grin. "Are you fixing to be a proper housewife any minute now?" "Don't you go scaring me," Lily laughed nervously. "I ain't slept a wink for 3 whole nights straight." "What on earth is there to be scared of?" "Because from here on out, it's all for real." Sarah plopped down right beside her and fingered the bright silk ribbons. "Well, I sure wouldn't be in any rush." I know. You wouldn't rush even if you had 10 years to spare." "And rightfully so. A girl's got to choose carefully." Lily shook her head with a fond smile, deciding not to argue the point. The whole village turned out to celebrate Lily's wedding in style. From the crack of dawn, the courtyard of Lily's homestead overflowed with people. Horse-drawn wagons lined the wooden fences. The long outdoor tables were laden with steaming platters of roasted meat and potato pies, and the local fiddlers sawed away on their instruments so loudly they could be heard clean across the valley. Sarah arrived alongside Clara and May. Dressed in her finest holiday gown, she predictably drew every eye in the place. The local bachelors cast lingering glances her way far more often than they did at the actual bride, a fact that didn't go unnoticed. "See that?" May whispered into Sarah's ear. "Even at somebody else's wedding, all eyes are locked right on you." "Let 'em look," Sarah replied coolly. "Staring doesn't cost a thing." Toward evening, a young man she had spotted lingering at previous country fairs stepped up to her. He was neat, well-mannered, and visibly bashful. "Might I have the honor of this dance?" he asked politely. "I suppose you can." They spun through one dance, then another, and by the third tune, the young man mustered the courage to steer the conversation toward more serious matters. "I've been hoping to get to know you better for a good long while now." "Well, you're doing it right now." "That ain't exactly what I meant, Sarah." Sarah instantly caught where he was driving. "What might your name be?" "Paul." "And just what is it you're trying to tell me, Paul?" "I want to ask your permission to come a-calling at your family's homestead." Sarah gave him a long, appraising look. "You got a house of your own, Paul?" "I do indeed." "Is it a big house?" Paul shifted uncomfortably from one boot to the other. "Not just yet, but I aim to build an addition once the crops come in." "Not just yet," she repeated coolly. "That's right." "Well then, you go on back and finish building it first." Paul's face flushed bright red and he snapped his mouth shut. He didn't ask her for another dance the rest of the night. May, who had overheard every word, grabbed Sarah by the wrist. "What is the matter with you?" "What did I even say?" "The man was being as sweet as pie to you." "And was I being sour? You didn't even give the poor boy a fighting chance. If his house is too small right now, then it's too small right now. I ain't fixing to sit around twiddling my thumbs waiting for him to break ground on a new wing." When the wedding festivities finally wound down and the exhausted guests began drifting home, Ethan walked alongside his daughter in total silence. Only when they reached their own front gate did he finally halt. "You know what truly baffles me, girl?" "What's that, Pa?" "You manage to sniff out a fatal flaw in every single man who crosses your path." "Well, everybody's got faults." "And what about you? Got any flaws of your own?" "Search me. Nobody's ever dared tell me I do." Ethan opened his mouth to fire back a retort, but just threw his hands up in defeat and kept walking. The very next morning, Clara dropped by their cabin with news that caused Martha to throw her hands up in utter astonishment. "I've gone and accepted a suitor of my own." Sarah offered her dear friend a warm smile, but for the first time, that joy felt heavy rather than light. Out of her 3 closest girlfriends, one was already a wedded wife, and the second was actively prepping for her own nuptials. For a brief, fleeting second, a cold thought darted through Sarah's mind. What happens if she ends up being the last unmarried maid left standing among them all? But she brushed the thought aside just as quickly, because that very afternoon, another strange cart pulled up to Ethan's gate, and Martha, peeking through the window glass, beamed brightly. "Sarah, honey, looks like our suitor today traveled all the way from over the county line." No sooner had Martha mentioned the suitor from the neighboring township, the usual flurry of pre-company panic swept through the cabin. Ethan even joked that they were going to have to construct a separate wooden bench outside for all the callers, seeing as suitors were dropping by more frequently than their own blood relatives. Sarah merely smiled to herself. She rather enjoyed watching everyone else get all flustered over something that had long since become routine to her. When the visitors stepped over the threshold, the young woman recognized the fellow immediately. It was none other than Paul, the very same young man she had coldly dismissed at Lily's wedding celebration. But this time he sat at the table looking grim, solemn, and intensely nervous. Sitting right beside him was his father, both of them solemnly clutching a beautifully embroidered courting towel. "Well now," Ethan began after the initial polite pleasantries were out of the way, "we're all ears." Paul swallowed hard and squared his broad shoulders. "We've come to ask for your parental blessing, Mr. Miller." Martha beamed with quiet satisfaction. She had always liked Paul. He was steady, hard-working, and entirely free of flashiness, the exact mold of man she considered husband material. The conversation dragged on for a good long while. Paul spoke eloquently about his farm, the fertile bottomland he had inherited from his grandfather, and the new timber barn he planned on raising come spring. Ethan listened intently, nodding his head in growing approval, while Sarah remained completely silent, simply sitting back and watching. When the visitors stepped over the threshold, the young woman recognized the fellow immediately. It was none other than Paul, the very same young man she had coldly dismissed at Lily's wedding celebration. But this time he sat at the table looking grim, solemn, and intensely nervous. Sitting right beside him was his father, both of them solemnly clutching a beautifully embroidered courting towel. "Well now," Ethan began after the initial polite pleasantries were out of the way, "we're all ears." Paul swallowed hard and squared his broad shoulders. "We've come to ask for your parental blessing, Mr. Miller." Martha beamed with quiet satisfaction. She had always liked Paul. He was steady, hard-working, and entirely free of flashiness, the exact mold of man she considered husband material. The conversation dragged on for a good long while. Paul spoke eloquently about his farm, the fertile bottomland he had inherited from his grandfather, and the new timber barn he planned on raising come spring. Ethan listened intently, nodding his head in growing approval, while Sarah remained completely silent, simply sitting back and watching. When the moment of truth arrived and all eyes pivoted to her, Sarah met Paul's gaze head-on and stated clearly, "No." Paul didn't even flinch, acting as if he had braced himself for this exact blow all along. "Might I know the reason why?" he asked quietly. "You may. And what is it? Your house is still too small." The cabin fell dead silent. Even Ethan didn't grasp what she meant at first. "Too small?" Paul echoed, bewildered. "That's right. But I told you right out I was planning on building an addition." "Well, you go on and finish building it, and then you can come back a-calling." Paul stared at her for a few agonizing seconds, then offered a sad, tired smile. "I reckon I understand." He hauled himself up out of the wooden chair. His father stood up right beside him without uttering a single word. Before heading out the door, Paul cast one final lingering look at Sarah. "You know, I rode out here today holding on to a lot of hope." "You wasted your trip." "I suppose I did." With those parting words, he walked out into the yard. Ethan escorted the subdued guests out to their buckboard and trudged back inside looking as dark as a thundercloud. Was it honestly on account of the house size again? "Sure was, Pa." "The boy's a hard worker and a good catch." "Maybe so, but I have no earthly desire to live packed in like sardines." "You ain't even set foot inside his place yet." "Don't need to. I saw enough from the outside." Ethan let out a heavy, bone-deep sigh. "You're gonna live to regret talk like that one day, mark my words." "I won't regret a thing." A few days later, Sarah ran into Paul down at the marketplace. He nodded to her with his customary politeness, but didn't make any move to halt or stretch out the encounter. A buddy of his was walking right alongside him. "Well," a teasing voice piped up, "you fixin' to frame out that new house now?" Paul offered a quiet grin. "I'm building it, but I'm building it for myself." And with that, he kept right on walking. For some reason, Sarah tracked his retreating back longer than was strictly necessary. That very evening, Clara dropped by with ribbons for her upcoming wedding wreath. Her big day was just around the corner. They sat together on the front porch step, soaking in the fiery sunset and whispering about the hazy shape of the future. "Aren't you scared at all?" Sarah suddenly asked out of the blue. "Scared of what?" "Scared you picked the wrong man." Clara paused for a moment of quiet reflection. "I suppose I am. A little." "And you're still going through with it anyway?" "Yes." "What makes you do that?" Clara smiled softly. "Because there ain't no such thing as a perfect human being, Sarah." Sarah opened her mouth to argue, but the words caught in her throat, leaving her mute. Meanwhile, over on the opposite edge of the village, two gossiping women drew water from the community well and clucked over a fresh batch of talk concerning the stubborn beauty who had just turned down yet another suitor. And one of them uttered a phrase that more and more folks would soon be echoing behind her back. "Keep on being too picky like that, and she'll ride that high horse straight into old age a lonely spinster." Sarah never heard the washerwomen's cutting words at the well, but they rippled through the village like wildfire. Within days, people were whispering them over the marketplace stalls, beside the wood stoves, out on the low front porches, and even after Sunday services while mingling in the churchyard. While the neighborhood clucked about Sarah, Clara had entirely different mountains to climb. With her wedding only days away, her whole family spun around like dervishes. Sarah pitched in constantly, helping her dear friend embellish the ceremonial linen cloths, sort through yards of lace ribbon, and pack the heavy oak dowry chest. Sometimes the girls laughed with the same carefree innocence they'd shared years ago. But more and more often their chatter circled back to the heavy realities of Clara's impending married life. "And what if he turns out to be bossy and ordering you around?" Sarah pressed her once. "Let him try," Clara laughed back. "You know me better than that." "What if he ain't nearly as sweet-tempered 6 months from now as he is today? Then we'll roll up our sleeves and learn how to weather the storms together. See there? That right there is precisely why I refuse to rush into anything." Clara fixed her friend with a long, piercing look. "Tell me truly, Sarah, are you just holding out, or are you plain old scared?" "Scared of what?" "Scared the man you get won't match up to the tall tales you've spun in your own head." Sarah waved the notion away with an impatient flick of her wrist, but her friend's words stubbornly anchored themselves in the back of her mind. Clara's wedding proved to be even more raucous and grand than Lily's. The crowd swelled so massively they had to set up extra feasting tables right out in the open yard. The local musicians sawed away at their fiddles without drawing a single breath. Wild children played tag, darting between the docked wagons, and elderly matrons continually stepped up to readjust the pine and flower wreath crowning the bride's head. Sarah once again found herself dragged right into the glaring spotlight. Young bachelors materialized out of thin air, one after another, begging for a dance, cracking jokes, and trying their level best to catch her ear. Yet tucked amongst them this time was a brand-new suitor. His name was Trofim. He was somewhat older than the other fellows, possessing rich bottomland, a booming honeybee apiary, and a small string of prime carriage horses. He made sure to rattle off this exact inventory to Sarah before he had even twirled her around the floor once. "I've got 3 rich bottomland plots right down by the river," he boasted. "Mighty fine, I'm sure. And 20 active beehives. That's lovely, too. Not to mention 2 matched pairs of carriage horses. Trofim, are you asking me for my hand in marriage, or are you trying to unload a farm catalogue on me?" A ripple of nervous laughter spread through the nearby bystanders. Even Trofim cracked a sheepish grin, though it looked somewhat forced. Nonetheless, right after the dance concluded, he marched straight over to Ethan and formally requested permission to call with his family's courting party. Sarah witnessed the exchange from a distance and let out a weary, rattling sigh. "Already?" May chimed in, sidling up beside her. "Already." Within the week, Trofim rolled up to their gate as promised, and once again the conversation inside the cabin revolved entirely around farming acreage, livestock counts, and dirt. Trofim became so utterly enchanted with cataloguing his own earthly wealth that he repeated several of his prized real estate statistics twice. When the mandatory moment for her reply arrived, Sarah sat mute for a suffocatingly long time. "Well," Martha prompted softly, her nerves fraying. "No." "What is it this time?" Ethan finally exploded, throwing his hands in the air. Sarah met Trofim's wounded stare. "The man loves the sound of his own voice way too much." "Well, what else am I supposed to talk about, woman?" he blurted out, deeply offended. "Search me, but I'm betting you could find a topic other than your horses to fill an entire evening." Once the thwarted suitors had packed up and rattled away down the lane, Ethan sat hunched over on the low porch step in stony silence. Sarah stepped outside to join him as the sun dipped below the tree line. "Did I hurt his pride too much?" she asked quietly. "Nope." "Then why are you sitting there looking like you swallowed a lemon?" "Just doing some hard thinking." "What on earth are you mulling over?" Ethan glanced down the dusty lane where the suitor's rig had vanished. I'm thinking about how Lily is already settled down, Clara's a wedded wife, and May'll be heading down the aisle next. And what of it? And you're still out here playing the field, turning down every man who draws breath." Sarah offered an unbothered smile. "Because I've got plenty of good options to choose from." Ethan didn't offer a single word in reply. A few days later, May joyfully broke the news to her girlfriends that she too had finally consented to a formal courting visit. Sarah offered her sincere, heartfelt congratulations and hugged her tight, drafting wedding plans together. But when she stepped back through her own front door that evening, the cabin felt abnormally, oppressively quiet. Martha was puttering silently by the wood stove. Ethan was out in the lean-to mending a wooden yoke. And Sarah was suddenly struck by the jarring realization that once May was gone, she would officially be the absolute last unmarried maiden remaining among her closest circle of friends. That chilling thought darted through her mind for only a second, but for the very first time it didn't strike her as funny in the slightest. The following day, a traveling merchant's wagon rolled into the village carrying strangers from parts unknown. And Martha, peering out through the wavy window glass, gasped in stunned surprise. "Ethan, look here! Looks like the suitors coming to call on us, Sarah, are starting to hail from way beyond the neighboring counties now." The merchant's wagon remained parked right outside Ethan's fence nearly until sundown. The folks who stepped down bore little resemblance to the local farm boys of her past. Their clothing was finely tailored and costly, their matched horses were meticulously groomed, and they carried themselves with the self-assured swagger of people accustomed to dealing with high-status landowners. Sarah peeked through the parlor window and permitted herself a smug smile. "See there, Ma? Now the high rollers are traveling from afar just to catch a glimpse of me." Martha made no effort to mask her fierce pride. "I told you all along, a beauty like yours was bound to become legendary." Ethan remained completely mute. He merely fixed his daughter with a long, unreadable stare, keeping his thoughts strictly to himself. The new suitor went by the name of Austin. He was the favored son of a wealthy merchant clan hailing from a distant valley settlement. Seated at the dinner table, he carried himself with absolute assurance, spoke with refined diction, and even tossed off a few clever jests. Sarah caught herself thinking more than once that listening to this man was vastly more stimulating than enduring the dull platitudes of the local boys. Yet the moment Austin launched into a grand monologue detailing his relentless ambitions to gobble up more acreage, acquire extra livestock herds, and build a sprawling business empire, she picked up on an underlying thread that thoroughly repulsed her. "And just when do you plan on pausing to actually live your life?" Sarah suddenly interrupted, cutting him dead in his tracks. Austin blinked, completely missing the drift of her query. "Live? Why, when I'm old and gray, I suppose. I'll be working hard every single day until then. How else is a man supposed to get ahead? Even on high holy days and Sabbath evenings? If there's coin to be made, work waits for no man." Sarah gave a slow, disappointed shake of her head. By the time the evening drew to a close, her verdict was already sealed in stone. As soon as the suitor's rig rumbled out of earshot, Ethan didn't even bother posing the obvious question. "Another flat no, I presume?" Another flat no. "And what mortal sin did this poor fellow commit to earn your wrath?" The man's got a brain engineered entirely around chasing profit. "Good gracious almighty," Martha groaned, sinking heavily onto the wooden bench. "Just what in tarnation is a proper master of a household supposed to think about, if not land and livestock? Search me, but there's got to be more to drawing breath than just accumulating dirt and cattle." Ethan pushed himself up from the table and marched straight out into the yard. For the first time, Sarah noticed that her father had taken to retreating into brooding silences far more often after each failed courting ritual. Months bled into one another, and the wedding day of May, the very last of her inner circle, finally arrived. The village rang from dawn till dusk with celebratory fiddle tunes and shouting voices. Sarah dutifully helped the blushing bride lace up her stays, carefully pinned silk ribbons into her hair, and even cracked a well-timed joke when May nearly hyperventilated from sheer nervous anticipation. But the instant the formal festivities kicked off, a strange hollow void opened up inside Sarah's chest. Lily sat nestled closely beside her husband. Clara beamed proudly at her own man's side. May was now the reigning queen of the day, and Sarah once again stood utterly alone amidst the swirling merrymaking. As evening descended and the musicians took a much-needed breather to wet their throats, the girlfriends gathered together to rest their feet near the woven fence line. "Well, that's the last of us," May sighed happily, smoothing down her skirts. "You're all officially hitched now," Sarah noted flatly. "You're looking mighty glum for a wedding guest, honey," Lily teased. "Me? Not on your life." "You're lying through your teeth," Clara challenged. Sarah opened her mouth to brush it off with a sassy quip, but for once the clever words completely failed to materialize. Clara pinned her with a penetrating stare. "You know, back when we were all younger, we used to bet cold hard cash that you'd be the very first one of us walking down the aisle." "So did I," May added softly. I suppose I simply refused to rush into settling for less. Or maybe it ain't about rushing anymore." Sarah's expression hardened into a prickly scowl. "Just what is that supposed to mean?" "Nothing at all," Clara backed down quickly. "Forget I spoke." On the carriage ride home under the blanket of night, Sarah maintained a stony silence the entire way. Ethan and Martha trudged along ahead in the dark, while Sarah stared up at the vast, indifferent canopy of stars, her mind ruthlessly replaying every single courting disaster of the past several years. Back then it had felt like she possessed all the time in the universe, that all she had to do was snap her fingers and a fresh queue of eager suitors would materialize at her front gate by morning light. But tonight, a brand new, terrifying thought sliced through her complacency. What if one day they simply stopped coming altogether? The next morning, down at the community well, she overheard two local hags gossiping over their buckets. It took Sarah a second to realize they were dissecting her. She's a looker, all right, a genuine stunner. But Mother Nature's clock doesn't stand still for anybody's vanity. Ain't it the truth? We'll just have to wait and see what tune she's whistling a few years down the road when the mirror starts telling a different story. Sarah snatched the rope of her water bucket, hauled it up with a vicious jerk, and stormed off without a backward glance. She wore an impenetrable mask of absolute indifference, but those spiteful washerwoman words burrowed deep into her brain and refused to vacate the premises. Only a few days later, as another stranger's cart rattled past their homestead, Ethan paused mid-stride, gazed out at the road, and uttered a phrase he had never dared speak aloud before. "Daughter, have you ever once stopped to ponder what's going to happen when the day arrives that a man finally looks your way and decides not to stop?" Years trickled away. At first, Sarah barely noticed the shifting sands. Life seemed suspended in amber, and the horizon still looked infinite. A year blew past after Lily's wedding, then a second. Sarah still drifted through the marketplace, still reeled in hungry men's stares, and still casually dashed the hopes of hopeful suitors with a flick of her wrist. On one rare afternoon outing, she stopped by Lily's homestead to drop off some fresh lard and found her cradling a chubby infant in one arm while a rambunctious toddler frantically tugged at the hem of her apron. "Don't you ever get bone-tired of all this endless hustle?" Sarah asked, watching the chaos unfold. "Oh, I'm tired all right," Lily laughed, wiping a smudge of flour from her cheek. "Exhausted down to my marrow. But the moment they finally quiet down and drift off to sleep at night, I feel like I'm the luckiest soul alive in this whole county." Sarah merely offered a polite, detached smile. At 19, she still hadn't assigned any real weight to those domestic words. She was utterly certain she had plenty of time to spare. Time to get hitched, time to bear a house full of babes, and time to audition a dozen more batches of hopeful suitors. The well of her youth seemed bottomless. Yet more years vanished into the ether. Clara was now bouncing a second babe on her knee. May was managing a bustling farmhouse of her own. Lily was constantly chasing after 3 rowdy boys, and Sarah still resided under her aging parents' roof. The parade of suitors steadfastly refused to halt. One was too gaunt, another was too much of a jaw-flapper. A third kept his lips sealed too tightly. The fourth was aging past his prime, and the fifth was wet behind the ears. A fatal flaw could always be found if you dug deep enough. "Daughter," Martha gently prodded one evening after another disastrous courting session had ended in swift dismissal, "do you even have the foggiest notion of what kind of man you're hunting for? I'll know him the instant I lay eyes on him, Ma. And what if you already crossed paths with him and sent him packing?" Sarah simply burst out laughing at the sheer absurdity of the notion. More time slipped through their fingers like dry sand. One evening Sarah ambled down to the local Saturday social gathering, only to experience the deeply unsettling realization that she scarcely recognized a single soul in attendance. Lily had long since abandoned these nocturnal frolics on account of her brood. Clara was entirely consumed with domestic duties, and May only surfaced once in a blue moon. Instead, the wooden benches overflowed with fresh-faced young lasses, 18-year-olds, bursting with giggles and unburdened by care, possessing the exact carefree glow she herself had worn a lifetime ago. As she lingered near the punch bowl, a snippet of whispered conversation drifted to her ears. "Is that her over there?" a fresh-faced girl whispered, pointing through the crowd. "Who?" "That Sarah woman everybody talks about." "Oh, you mean the one all those out-of-town suitors used to march in for?" "The very same. Word is she used to be an absolute stunner back in her day." Sarah felt as though an invisible fist had slammed directly into her solar plexus. Not because anyone had called her elderly, no one had dared utter that word, but that single past tense word, was, slashed straight through her heart like a rusty blade. She spun on her heel and bolted straight home into the dark, unable to stomach another second of the festivities. The very next morning she forced herself to attend a baby christening hosted by Clara. The cabin overflowed with organized chaos. Infants wailed, toddlers chased a stray barn cat between the benches, and mothers shouted across the room. Sarah sat quietly tucked in the corner, taking it all in. Once upon a time she would have judged such a domestic circus as pure, unadulterated madness. Now, to her utter shock, she found herself secretly warming up to the raw, vibrant noise. Clara's toddler daughter toddled over, planted herself right in Sarah's lap, and proudly brandished a crudely carved wooden duck. "Pretty," the child lisped. "Mighty pretty," Sarah breathed. "You got one of these at your house?" "No, honey, I don't." "Well, you ought to tell your mister to carve you one." The child delivered the line with such innocent, matter-of-fact simplicity that the entire dinner table erupted into uproarious laughter. Sarah merely smiled softly, dropped her gaze, and turned to stare out the rain-streaked window pane. That evening, Ethan trudged back from a late errand at the neighbour's farm and settled down silently on the low porch step right beside his quiet daughter. He sat mute for a long spell before finally breaking the stillness. "Remember Gale, my oldest working hand down at the grist mill?" "I remember him, Pa." "He just started learning how to swing a scythe out in the south paddock today, growing up fast." Sarah slowly lifted her eyes to meet her father's weary gaze. Ethan didn't lecture, didn't scold, and didn't offer any unsolicited advice.
He simply stared out into the gathering dusk. And in that quiet moment, Sarah finally comprehended the sheer terrifying velocity of the years that had slipped through her fingers. That very night, insomnia clamped down hard on her eyelids. Tossing and turning in the suffocating dark, she felt the first genuine, bone-chilling spike of panic, the sudden suffocating terror that one fine day no more suitors would ever turn their wagons down their lane again.
Within a few weeks, the village rumor mill caught fire with whispers regarding a mysterious bachelor who was rumored to be arriving soon to claim a substantial land inheritance left to him by a distant, long-lost uncle. At the time, Sarah still foolishly assumed this new arrival would simply be another notch on her belt, another suitor to judge and dismiss. Still, well before dawn broke, Sarah woke to the sound of children laughing outside her window glass. At first, she couldn't place the source of the joyful noise. Then she recalled that Lily and her family had dropped by for a late visit the evening before and were bunking down with kinfolk just down the lane. Their boisterous youngsters were already tearing up the dirt road, chasing an old wooden wagon hoop with a stick. Sarah rolled over to bury her face in the feather pillow, knowing sleep was entirely out of the question. She threw on a knitted shawl, shoved her feet into her scuffed leather house shoes, and stepped out into the crisp morning air. Ethan was already hauling a heavy yoke of water buckets up from the community well. "Up and at 'em early today, little lady." "Couldn't keep my eyes shut, Pa." "Must be getting old on us," her father teased with a wink. "Oh, real funny." Ethan chuckled softly, hoisting the wooden yoke across his broad shoulders as he headed back toward the barn. Back in the day, such light-hearted jabs would have rolled right off Sarah's back, but today they brought to mind the washerwomen's cutting remarks, her girlfriend's knowing looks, and the memory of the suitor she had rudely banished over the size of his house frame. Later that day, she resolved to walk over and check in on Clara. Along the way, her mind wandered through trivial thoughts. The weather, the upcoming harvest fair, the new batch of embroidered hand towels Martha was working on. But the instant she crossed the threshold of her friend's crowded cabin, every idle thought vanished into thin air. Absolute pandemonium reigned indoors. One wild boy was gleefully tugging the family tabby cat by its tail. Another was trying to scale the tall pantry shelves, and a newborn infant was wailing at the top of its lungs from a woven willow cradle. Clara dashed frantically between them all, trying desperately to restore some semblance of order. Spotting Sarah standing frozen in the doorway, she burst into a breathless, relieved laugh. "Thank the good Lord above you stopped by." "Is it always this absolute of a madhouse around here?" "Lord, I hope so. How else would we run a home?" Sarah stepped forward and scooped the crying baby out of the cradle. The infant instantly quieted, snuggling against her collarbone. "See there?" Clara beamed, wiping sweat from her brow. "You'd make a natural-born mother, Sarah." Sarah froze mid-breath. "I wouldn't go that far." "I would. I know it in my bones." "How could you possibly know a thing like that?" "Because you've got a gentle soul when it comes to little ones, no matter how hard you try to pretend you're made of stone." Sarah offered no reply. As she finally gathered her things to head back home, Clara's oldest boy darted up to her skirts. "Aunt Sarah, how come you ain't got any babies of your own?" The cabin dropped into a pin-drop silence. Clara froze with a stack of folded linens clutched tightly to her chest. "I just don't, buddy." "How come?" "Because that's just the way the cookie crumbles." The little boy stared up at her with uncomprehending, innocent eyes. "That don't make no sense at all." Clara swooped in instantly, whisking her son away with a sharp reprimand. But the child's innocent inquiry struck Sarah far deeper and sharper than any malicious village gossip ever could. Her walk home was agonizingly slow. Passing one homestead, she watched a young father lofting his toddler into the air while the mother beamed from the porch.
Passing the next, a sturdy farmer was mending a split fence rail while his small son eagerly handing him wooden pegs. Once upon a time, she would have walked right past such mundane domestic tableaus without blinking an eye. Now they seemed etched into every corner of the landscape, mocking her solitary state. That evening, May stopped by unannounced, bearing a heavy basket of crisp autumn apples plucked straight from her new orchard, and stayed on to share a simple supper of rye bread and bean soup. The dinner table conversation naturally drifted to children, then to farming chores, then to winter stores. Sarah sat listening quietly, only to realize with a sickening jolt that she possessed virtually nothing of substance to contribute to the dialogue. Back in the day, their conversations had centered entirely on Saturday night dances, flirtatious farm boys, colorful ribbons, and fairgrounds. Now, her girlfriends inhabited an entirely different universe, speaking a language she couldn't translate. "You're awfully quiet tonight, Sarah," May noted, pausing with her spoon halfway to her mouth. "Just doing some thinking." "About what?" "Oh, this and that." "You ain't still brooding over those pesky suitors, are you?" May teased with a light-hearted laugh. "Maybe I am, and maybe I ain't. Don't you go borrowing trouble. Your time will come around just like the rest of ours." Sarah managed a tight, unconvincing smile, but the warmth of it didn't reach her eyes.
Within days, the local gossip mill reached a fever pitch concerning the mysterious new landowner who had finally taken up residence in Old Man Zacharias' abandoned homestead. The news sprouted fresh, scandalous details faster than thistleweeds in an unplowed cornfield. Some swore up and down he was rolling in gold coins. Others claimed he possessed a razor-sharp intellect. And the village bachelors insisted he was a confirmed bachelor with an eye for trouble. The village matrons dissected his lineage by the community well. The men debated his worthiness down at the blacksmith's forge, and the young lasses surreptitiously craned their necks every time a wagon rumbled past, desperate to catch a glimpse of his face. Sarah listened to the endless clucking with feigned indifference. Another man, another ambitious farmer, another chapter in the endless soap opera of village life. At least that was what she continually told herself. But that very evening, Ethan trudged home well before dark, kicked off his mud-caked work boots on the porch, and announced straight from the threshold, "He's arrived." "Who's arrived?" Martha asked, pausing with her mixing spoon in mid-air. "That nephew of old Zacharias." "You don't say. Already got his sleeves rolled up and starts swinging an axe over at the old place." Sarah merely gave a single, dismissive nod and went back to peeling apples into a ceramic bowl. She didn't even bother lifting her chin, completely unaware that a mere heartbeat away lay the exact man who would soon shatter her restless nights and rewrite the trajectory of her entire existence. Nearly a full week elapsed since the arrival of Zacharias' heir, and Sarah still hadn't crossed paths with him face to face. Or rather, she had deliberately avoided crossing paths with him. Gossip regarding the mysterious new master of the homestead filled the void quite nicely on its own. The women at the well clucked about how astonishingly fast he had set to work clearing the overgrown orchards. The townsfolk at the market swore he had single-handedly rebuilt the rotting split-rail fence before the morning dew had even dried, and the local maidens engaged in endless whispered debates regarding his marital status. Sarah pretended to tune out the endless chatter. "They're calling him Semon, apparently," May piped up during a chance encounter by the mercantile. "So what if they are?" "Oh, nothing much. Just thought you'd like to keep a running tally." May offered a knowing, wicked grin. "Strange, though, you used to be the very first one to demand a full character breakdown on every newcomer that blew into town. I just don't happen to find this one particularly riveting, that's all." Yet she couldn't stop her mind from involuntarily chewing on that simple name all through the long, lonely evening. A few days later, Sarah hauled herself out to the bustling marketplace. The autumn air hummed with energy.
Merchants screamed out the prices of root vegetables and homespun wool, and shoppers jostled for prime positioning along the vendor lanes. Sarah paused in front of a colorful stall draped with silk ribbons, haggling over the cost of sewing thread, when a familiar deep baritone echoed just behind her shoulder. "Hold your horses there, Paul. Don't you go wandering off." She spun around on her heel. Standing mere feet away was none other than Paul, the very same Paul she had haughtily dismissed months ago over the square footage of his unfinished cabin. But the man standing here now was a starkly different picture.
Clinging tightly to his side was a cheerful, rosy-cheeked wife, while a pack of 3 boisterous children darted circles around their legs. The youngest boy sat perched proudly on his father's broad shoulders, frantically reaching out to snatch a carved wooden whistle from a hanging display. "Daddy, please can we buy it?" the child whined. "And if I buy you that whistle, will you give your ma at least 1 solid hour of blessed silence?" Paul chuckled, his eyes crinkling with deep affection. His wife gave his arm a playful, affectionate nudge. The children dissolved into giggles. The entire family radiated an undeniable golden aura of quiet contentment. Paul's eyes suddenly locked onto Sarah, standing frozen amidst the crowd. He blinked in surprise, then offered a calm, unbothered nod. "Afternoon, Sarah." "Afternoon, Paul. How are Ethan and Martha holding up?" "Fair to middling, thank the Lord. Give 'em my best regards when you get back." "I surely will." The entire exchange lasted barely a heartbeat. Then Paul hoisted his youngest son higher on his shoulders and continued down the crowded lane, shepherding his brood along. Sarah tracked his retreating back until the family dissolved completely into the sea of bobbing heads and canvas awnings. "What on earth are you daydreaming about now?" Lily's voice piped up right beside her ear, snapping her out of her reverie. Sarah gave a violent start. "Oh, nothing at all." "You're lying through your teeth again." Lily followed the trajectory of her fixed stare.